Well, greetings, brethren. Happy Sabbath to all of you. Lovely to see you. And it's good to be here on a day that God has commanded us to be here. But of course, many people observe days that God is not commanded, that He does not desire. And we're coming up on one of those big time. Actually, there's one every week. It's called Sunday. But there's a big celebration coming up this next week on Wednesday. And that is, of course, Christmas, December 25th. But that night, I'll mention, is the beginning of actually Hanukkah this year after that, which is a biblical festival in the sense that we see it mentioned in the Bible, in the New Testament, actually. But it's not one that's commanded in the law, but it's certainly good to take note of because it recalls something very important, as we've discussed many times. But I want you to right now to turn over to Deuteronomy 12, and this is something that in relation to Christmas and these days we often will turn to, and I've mentioned it here recently in going through what Martin Luther King Jr. pointed out about the origins of many of these Christian practices, and that's going to be an article in the January-February issue of the Beyond Today magazine. But right here in Deuteronomy 12, of course, we're given the instruction in verse 29, when the Lord your God cuts off from before you the nations which you go to dispossess, and you displace them and dwell in their land, take heed to yourself that you're not ensnared to follow them after they're destroyed from before you, and you do not inquire after their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods? I'll do likewise. I'll serve God the way they serve their gods. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, for every abomination of the Lord which he hates they have done to their gods, for they burn even their sons and daughters in the fire. And people think, oh, that's all we're not supposed to do. No, God very clearly says, whatever I command you, be careful to observe it. You should not add to it nor take away from it. You're not to take things from paganism, from pagan worship to worship God. And I don't know if you've seen it, but you should take a look. The current biblical worldview that Mr. Shaby has on posted right now, where he's talking about some of these Christmas customs. He plays a little clip there of Pat Robertson. And Pat Robertson's actually freely admitting, he's just going straight through, he says, all these things, Christmas and all these, the Christmas tree and all these things we do, pagan, pagan, pagan. But he says, because we've Christianized these things, like it's some great conquest, some wonderful thing that's been done. And that's, of course, very sad, because that's not what God says to do. God says, don't do that. But over the past several years, there's been a pushback in the mainstream Christian world against the idea of Christmas as coming from paganism. And they'll say December 25th, no, that really is the birthday of Jesus, or that was the birthday that the early church had for Jesus, and it wasn't taken from the pagan customs. And there's, so I want to talk about today. I've titled this Answering New Arguments for December 25th, Answering New Arguments for December 25th. This was something published in Biblical Archaeology Review magazine in winter 22, some about calculating Christmas, about Hippolytus, the early church father Hippolytus, in December 25th. He says, many readers will be familiar with the common refrain that December 25th, Christmas, was originally a pagan holiday, perhaps corresponding to the Roman festival of Saturnalia or the feast of the sun god Sol. As the chorus goes, the date was chosen for the birth of Jesus to make Christianity chime with a polytheistic society already attuned to December 25th revelry. But is the old song true? I used to sing this kind of anti-carol, but then while translating a treatise on Hippolytus for Rome, I came across a passage stating that Jesus was born on December 25th. Now, Hippolytus was a Christian author who wrote in the early 3rd century AD, so the 200s, and Saturnalia and the Feast of Sol were not celebrated on December 25th, that early in Roman history. Saturnalia never was. Saturnalia is from like the 17th or up to the 21st and sometimes pushed a little bit later, and the Feast of Sol only came to be later. They're saying it was moved to later on December 25th. So Hippolytus clearly could not have chosen the date to please pagan sentiments. And of course, there's many more arguments here about what happened. Let me give you more of the argument before we go to addressing it. And part of what they say is that the argument goes that in AD 274, following his victories in the east, the Emperor Aurelian, who was a pagan, by the way, built a temple and instituted quadrennial games every 4 years on behalf of Sol Invictus, pagan sun god, to whom he attributed his victories. And later, this was proclaimed by Constantine, by the way, to observe Natalis, the birthday of the unconquered sun. And that was, Aurelian brought it in, and it was still promulgated at the time of, under Constantine, who was supposedly the first Christian emperor. And they say, Constantine brought in this pagan day that had been instituted to worship Jesus. And so that they say that this is the common idea, but it's all wrong because already the Christians had observed from time immemorial December 25th. And there's this kind of complex argument where they say they take the practice of the Jews. The Jews had this thing called integral chronology, where you would take the day of death of someone, one of these Old Testament figures, and the idea was they were that's the same day they were born, because they say they died on this date and they were born on this date. And so this kind of came down to this time of Jesus, and they're saying, they came to the conclusion that Jesus died March 25th. And by the way, March 25th was the early date of the vernal equinox, the spring equinox. And that was also, by the way, a pagan celebration. How about that? But they say that's when Jesus died, or some say he was resurrected then. And then they say, well, then, not that he was born 1 year prior to that, but they say he was conceived 1 year prior to that. That's when it was announced. And so that would have been March 25th, and 9 months later would be December 25th, when he was actually born. So there's all these kind of convoluted arguments about how they came to this conclusion based on these things, but that's not really even the same thing. That's sticking in a third element besides the birth and death. It's sticking in the conception, and so you end up with this mishmash that try to justify this. Now, some people say, they didn't really get it from the pagans, and they didn't necessarily get it from this idea of integral chronology either, because that's obviously different from the ways the Jews were doing it. And so what it really was we can just trust that this was the early date for Jesus' birthday, was December 25th. And then they tried to do this calculation stuff around that and came up with March 25th for the date of his death based on that, based on the fact that this was already understood. Now, guess what? There's no real proof of this. But we do see December 25th mentioned early on, before it was instituted in the empire as that day of celebration officially, as something that the Christians, or at least some of them, were keeping. They were following this date of Jesus' birth. But why were they? Okay, so what the argument also goes, and I heard this recently, Dr. Halsden sent me something from Hillsdale College where the guy was basically pushing out this whole line, and he was saying that they didn't take anything from the pagans because they were very anti-pagan, and so they didn't really want to adopt all that. Well, I have several things to mention in response to this, and I'll just go through them quickly because, obviously we could go through this all day, but I do want to address some of these things. Number one, I would point out that Tertullian, one of the early church fathers, around 200 was complaining against Christians banqueting at the Saturnalia and the Brumae and the January calends. That's the 1st of January, New Year's. The Brumae, though, referring to the solstices. Now, we have quoted that, by the way, that thing about Tertullian in the past as the Brumalia, saying there's the Saturnalia, and it went up through the 24th or so, and the next day was the Brumalia. That's not actually correct. I have learned in going through this that in some contexts the Brumalia refers to a feast of November 24th, but that was evidently a later development of celebrating the whole month leading up to the winter solstice. So you started November 24th and you ended up, at December 25th, basically. You end up, that whole month was a celebration of the Brumalia. And Bruma, the word Bruma, is actually a contraction of the Latin word brevissima, referring to the briefest, the shortest day, which is the solstice. Okay, and so that's the technical term. The brevissima was for the solstice. And the elder and others note that the winter solstice was about December 25th. That had been long held to be the date of the solstice, even though it kind of rotated out of that. But that had still traditionally long been the date of the solstice. So, number two. So basically, this idea was the solstice was being celebrated early on, is what I'm going to make about that in the Bruma. And the Christians were doing that as well. Now, second, the winter solstice was long observed by the ancient world as the birth of the sun god. And many pagan sun cults, such as Mithraism, were established throughout the Roman Empire well before the birth of Jesus on December 25th. And that idea that it was the birth of the sun on December 25th was given official recognition later by the empire. Early on, December 25th was regarded as the solstice date, even though later calendars have it a bit earlier. Even in this one Barr article, this Biblical Archaeology Review article, says directly that the Roman solstice date was December 25th, and that the Roman spring equinox was March 25th. How does the author imagine that these were not significant pagan occasions? That's what the pagans worship, were these specific natural occasions. Third, the Saturnalia and the calends of January, the 1st of January, were huge pagan celebrations in the empire, and there were just a few days between them. So even if December 25th was not a specific pagan worship day, tucking the birth of Christ into this slot would not be coincidental, given the pagan connections of this period, especially as many elements of these pagan worship days became attached to Christianity early on, despite some church leaders complaining about that. 4, a major crux of this argument is that Hippolytus already accepted Jesus' birth on December 25th, about 50 years before the Feast of Sol Invictus was claimed to be on that day, and this fits with his acceptance of Jesus' conception 9 months earlier in March. Well, this is silly. I mean, the latter is just this mathematical calculation after accepting December 25th for the birth, so it's really circular reasoning. And the predating of the birthday of the sun being declared must assume that the emperor, and this is what this one guy that Brian sent me was arguing, that Aurelian picked this day from the Christians. That he got December 25th from the Christians, which were growing in the empire, to sort of unify his empire. But he was a pagan, and he was not for the Christians in that sense. Why would he do that? It just doesn't make any sense. I mean, later it would make sense maybe for somebody like Constantine later to do that, but Aurelian was declaring December 25th the date of the sun god's birthday. It doesn't make any sense. Another big aspect we've said in the past, and I'll note here what Scott Ashley said about this. He said, for me, this is number 5, is that Jesus couldn't have been born in the middle of winter because the shepherds were in the fields with their flocks, which makes no sense if this were late December. And he mentioned that he and Darius McNeely about froze in Jerusalem in the cold and rain when they stayed over after the feast a few days in November, much less December. That this is, now some people argue against that. There's even a whole argument about it. At the time they had these sheep for the temple at Bethlehem, and that they were out at that time. There's an argument for it, but it doesn't hold water to me, because you just wouldn't be putting your flocks out at risk like that, even though there may have been some warmer days. Mostly it was not have been. But here's a big one too, number 6, that he also mentioned, and I will say this is a very big one, is that the Romans, Caesar Augustus in particular, were masters of efficiency, and they would not have conducted a census in the middle of winter. It would have been self-defeating. No matter what reasoning someone comes up with to try to justify a December 25th date, they run headlong into this black wall. And Darius McNeely said, yeah, Caesar was, he commented on this, was very practical. The Romans would not plan a census in late December due to their festivities and the fact that the colder weather impeded government operations. Armies did not march and fight in winter. The census of Quirinius would more logically have been conducted during a feast pilgrimage season, which the fall provided. The Jews were already on the move toward Jerusalem and Judea. Count them and fleece them. As they worship their, unknown God at the end of their harvest season would have been the Roman reasoning, and I agree with that. That makes total sense. And the last thing I'll mention here is that some Christians did revert to pagan ways. Some Christians did revert to pagan ways, and I'll just reference for you Galatians 4, verse where he mentions you worship days and seasons and years, and he was talking about, he called those the elements of the world. They were going back to their pagan days. And he was criticizing for that. And of course, Tertullian, which I mentioned earlier, talked about how Christians were participating in these pagan celebrations. So they would have tried to wrap it all up into one big thing. And there are some other arguments, and I don't have time for that. Some arguments with the course of Abijah, which I'll go into sometime. I don't think we can rely on that as an argument. Some people use it as an argument for December 25th. But that's wrong because I believe that that course moved throughout the year. So we'll go into that some other time. But finally, I just want to note that you've got this acceptance of, sorry, I had my page marked and I've just lost it. Well, I'll just say this. Jesus was not born on December 25th, but he may have been conceived around that time. But I think it was more likely at the time of Hanukkah, because if he was born in September, which we say 9 months before that, would be at the time of late December. So he could have been born at that time, and was he? We don't know. I mean, it's very possible. But even if it could be proved that Jesus was born on December 25th or even thereabout, there is absolutely no reason for observing that date. There's a lot more to say about it, and maybe we'll talk some more after, but we can trust that that this was a pagan celebration that we should not have anything to do with. We should separate ourselves from it, as God tells us to separate ourselves from all such things, and just be glad that we know the truth as the times get darker.